Study Session 5. The Psychoanalytic Ego Personality Theory of Erik Erikson. Introduction. In this study session, you will examine the Eriksonian school of thought on personality formation. The school of thought theory is a reaction to Freud's proposition. The thinking of the school is that personality is influenced by the internal conflict a man experiences, and also by the external environment of man. According to this school, it is what the external environment dictates that is internalized, which causes the internal conflict. When you have studied this session, you should be able to discuss the major focus of Erik Erikson's view on personality, and also explain how personality is manifested in different stages of human development. Overview of Erikson's theory on personality. Erikson's theory on personality is an offshoot of the Freudian theory. The difference being that Freud sees human behavior as purely a function of the internal conflict, whereas Erikson suggests that in addition to the internal conflict, human behavior is also affected by the external social world and by the interaction between the social world and the psychic apparatus. The psychoanalytic ego psychology is interested in the process by which a sense of self develops and how the self adjusts to various social experiences throughout the course of a lifetime. Wilson, 1987. Erikson argues that human personality development is in stages and runs throughout a lifetime, unlike the position of Freud that the personality development ends in childhood. Erikson identifies 8 stages of development that the ego passes through. Each stage experiences peculiar crisis that is to be resolved. How the crisis at each stage is resolved informs the kind of personality identity that will emerge, with implications for behavioral and attitudinal dispositions. The 8 psychosocial stages of development of Erikson's theory. Basic trust versus mistrust. This stage occurs in infancy. The crisis at this stage is whether the child will develop basic trust or mistrust. If the child's physiological needs, e.g. food, water, psychological and emotional needs, e.g. warmth, affection, care, are promptly and adequately met, then the child develops basic trust. He sees the world as predictable and comforting. He willingly embraces new people and objects without much protest. On the other hand, if a child experiences unmet or erratically met physiological, psychological, and emotional needs, he tends to see the world as a harsh, unfriendly place, and as such, the child develops mistrust. Autonomy versus shame and doubt. This is the toddler and preschool age child. The major issue at this stage is control. The child wants to assert himself and do his own things. At this stage, the child requires firm handling and enforced guidelines by parents. If this is successfully done, the child establishes autonomy and positive ego identity, whereas a child that lacks firm handling develops a sense of shame and self-doubt. Initiative versus guilt. At about the age of 4 or 5, a child begins to exhibit initiative by setting goals, initiating activities and course of actions to reach the goals. If there is excessive parental control and punishment at this stage, the child becomes guilty-ridden and loses all sense of self and spontaneity. If it is otherwise, The child develops sense of initiative. Industry versus inferiority. The period of middle childhood is characterized by this crisis. It is the child's first sustained interaction with the social world beyond the family. If this interaction is successful and gratifying, the ego becomes stronger and the child develops a sense of self-competence. Otherwise, the child develops a feeling of inadequacy. Identity versus role confusion. At adolescence, the challenge of establishing an identity is predominant. It is a period when the child ceases to be searching for himself. Who am I? If the crisis is positively resolved, the child establishes a unique identity. If not, role confusion results. Intimacy versus isolation. This is a stage when the young adult makes more intimate contact and permanent commitments, gives more considerations to choosing a life partner. A successful resolution of the crisis at this stage leads to the development of healthy intimate relationships, while the opposite leads to a feeling of alienation. Generativity versus stagnation. The middle age is characterized by the desire to care for and nurture others. Generativity. If this desire is not achieved, the individual develops a feeling of stagnation, that is, feeling of wasting away. Ego integrity versus despair. This is the final stage, the stage at which the individual takes stock of his past life, crisis, and impending death. If he is satisfied with how the crises over the years have been resolved, then the ego acquires a sense of ego integrity. Otherwise, a sense of despair is developed. Assessment techniques. Erikson always identified himself as a psychoanalyst and paid homage to Freud's thought and techniques. At the same time, he extended and modified many of Freud's concepts and methods. A basic difference in his technique compared with that of Freud is in Erikson's view of the relationship between the therapist and the client. He adopted a more egalitarian and personal stance towards his clients than did Freud. Thus, Erikson advocated a stance of disciplined subjectivity, in which the therapist seeks to analyze and understand the client's problems through empathy, as well as by examining historical events that have affected the patient's life. Erikson used Freudian concepts and procedures of transference, free association, and dream analysis in his work, but his usage differs in a number of respects from Freud's. For instance, Erikson typically interpreted dreams in psychosocial terms in an attempt to preserve and enhance the patient's identity, open bracket, because he believed that dreams are more likely to revolve around questions of identity than of sexuality, close bracket. Erikson also employed a variety of play therapy techniques in assessing his patients. This was informed basically by the kind of patient he had. Unlike Freud, who had primarily psychotic adults to work with, most of Erikson's patients were children. Therefore, he had to use techniques that are appropriate to that age group. Psychohistorical analysis has another technique of Erikson. As an assessment technique, psychoanalysis takes a broad perspective that includes an appreciation of the tremendous impact of political, economic, social, and cultural forces on the development of the personality of an individual. It also seeks to recognize and take into account the subtle ways in which the analyst's own values, experiences, and historical background guide his interpretation of the patient's life. Study session summary. Erik Erikson's theory about personality development is an offshoot of the Freudian theory. He identified the 8 stages of psychosocial development as basic trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt, initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority, identity versus role confusion, intimacy versus isolation, generativity versus stagnation, and ego integrity versus despair. End of study session 5. Thank you for listening.